The latest from the Russia-Ukraine war, or the parallel war as we are calling it. An attack took place in Russia's Belgorod Oblast region after midnight on Monday. 8 people were injured in that attack. The region's governor initially blamed the attack on a Ukrainian sabotage group.
Большая часть населения покинула территорию. У кого нет возможности, помогаем на своем транспорте. У кого есть возможность, покидает на личном транспорте.
However, a Ukrainian media report citing military intelligence said that 2 Russian opposition groups had carried out the attack. And a senior aide to Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Kyiv had nothing to do with the attack. He pinned it on Russia's emerging violent resistance movement. All right, you saw those pictures. Now let's take a look at where this attack took place on a map. Now, Belgorod Oblast is a Russian administrative region. You can see this. This is the Belgorod Oblast. It borders Ukraine's Kyiv Oblast. Now, this Graviornsky is the region to watch out for because this is where that said attack has taken place. So this is the Belgorod Oblast region, which is now the centerpiece of the so-called parallel war. It is about 80 kilometers from the Ukrainian city of Kyiv. Now, what happened in Belgorod? What is the regional governor there saying? His statement says that the Ukrainian so-called sabotage group entered the WION region. Okay, so this is what the regional governor is saying. They are blaming it on a so-called Ukrainian sabotage group. 2 towns were targeted, he is saying. These 2 towns were Borisovka and WION. These are the 2 towns that have been targeted by those attackers. Houses and administrative buildings have been damaged in these 2 towns in the Belgorod region, and people over there living in these towns are being asked to leave the scene of fighting. That's what the regional governor is saying. So situation seemingly serious over there, and it is so serious at the moment that the governor is saying that the counter-terrorism regime has been imposed in that region. It's the first time since the start of the war in Ukraine that this counter-terrorism regime has been imposed. A similar regime, remember, was in place in Chechnya between 1999 and 2009 when Russian authorities were battling insurgents over there. Now, who is behind the Belgorod attack? What are the either sides claiming? The Russian governor is saying that there was a Ukrainian sabotage group which entered into the Russian territory and carried out that attack. That's what the Russian side is saying. What is the Ukrainian side saying? Now, Ukrainian media is citing their military intelligence to say that there are 2 groups called the Liberty of Russia Legion and Russian Volunteer Corps. These are 2 Russian opposition groups. They are saying that these are behind that attack that has taken place in Belgorod. Let's talk about these groups. Liberty of Russia Legion is a Ukraine-based Russian armed group. So that's what Liberty of Russia Legions is. And what does it say? What is its aim? Liberty of Russia's Legion says that it is working inside Russia to overthrow Putin. So it's an anti-Putin group that is operating within Russia. So Ukrainian military intelligence is saying that this group is behind the attack. Now let's look at some of the statements coming in. This is the senior aide to Ukrainian president. What is he saying? He's saying that Russian liberation movement could contribute to correct end of war in Ukraine. So he's talking about the correct end of war in Ukraine. What could that be? That's not clear at the moment. Architects of violent Russian resistance movement are exclusively citizens of Russia. So what he's saying is these people who have carried out the attack in Belgorod are citizens of Russia. Ukraine has nothing to do with it. So this is what is the statement coming from Ukraine. Now, what is the statement coming out of Russia. This is the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. He is saying that President Vladimir Putin has been informed about the incident and work is underway to drive out the saboteurs. So this is what Kremlin spokesperson is saying, that Putin has been apprised of what exactly is going on in Belgorod. Joining us now on the broadcast, we have John Blaxland. He's a professor of intelligence studies and international security at the Defence Studies Centre of the Australian National University. Thanks very much, sir, for speaking to us.
Good to be with you, Rohit.
Sir, I want to begin by asking you about this so-called parallel war that is going on at the moment there, which is driven by the intelligence communities from either side. Talk to us about that. How does that impact the larger conflict in the region?
So it is definitely a very significant development and an interesting complement to the broader campaign at play. The Ukrainian forces are able to capitalize on this Russian volunteer corps, and the rhetoric behind it is actually deeply unnerving to the Russian side. It speaks to significant weaknesses that complement the uncertainty around what's happening with groups like the Wagner Group that has claimed victory in Bakhmut, but is actually running away, claiming to be leaving by the 1st of June. Why? Because they're afraid of being caught in a pincer movement from the Ukrainians. I think the Ukraine is actually seeking to have a multi-pronged offensive operations, these kind of special forces operations behind the lines, Russian volunteers, Ukrainian supported, perhaps it appears causing havoc for Ukraine, for the Russian forces as they look to consolidate their territories. The Russian position, of course, is very much a defensive one, reflected in the very long defensive line that's been constructed through the winter to protect Russia's claimed territory from the offensives that are expected in the coming weeks and months. Ukraine doesn't have to attack straight away. It's playing a bit of mind games as well. So the counter-attack in Bakhmut appears to be proceeding, and these operations around the Belgorod area are certainly ones that point to a plan that seems to have been gestating for some time now, to get behind the lines inside the Russian occupied territories, draw on local support where possible, cause disruption, undermine morale, attack critical infrastructure, critical supplies in ways that maybe, what we need to be remembering that Russia has been adapting its tactics. It has changed the way it does business. It's learned from the mistakes of last year. It's now dispersed. It's now looking to be more protective of its troops, much more conscious of radio and telephone and phone security.
Yes.
So this work of the special forces is more important than ever.
Sir, I want to understand this, the Liberty of Russia Legion, Russian Volunteer Corps. How do they operate in that region? How are they recruited by the intelligence community from the other side? Both sides are having this intel war. There are Russian loyalists that have been recruited within Ukraine. There are Ukrainian loyalists recruited within the Russian territory. How do these operate, sir?
So, as I say, they're operating with special forces tactics. They're operating in a way that is designed to confuse and get around and circumvent the conventional forces that the Russian army has in the trenches along the border, the demarcation point where the troops are, the forward line of operating troops. This is classic special operations. You can call it terrorism. It's certainly, terrorism is in the eye of the beholder, but it's basically conventional special forces operations behind enemy lines. Of course, it's worth remembering that while that's going on, there is grave fears about what Russia has been doing around the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia. So we need to remember that what's happening around Belgorod is part of the equation. There's a number of components to the campaign plan, if you like, that need to be carefully managed.
Yes.
trying to stop the Russians from being able to effectively use that, perhaps to exploit it as a potentially dirty bomb, is a real concern and our top priority.
Interesting there. Sir, last couple of questions. You know, this counter-terrorism regime that has been imposed over there, the regional governor is saying, now this is something, a similar thing was happened in Chechnya when they were battling insurgents there. So I want to talk to you about the ground situation. Looking at the information we have in the public domain, how serious do you think is the situation there on the ground?
So in Belgorod and places like that, this is classic. What you need to do, you know, the Russian view is that to prevent this from getting out of hand, they exercise extreme powers. They're basically, you know, there's no mercy given, there's no quarter given. But let's face it, this has been the approach that Russia's taken for quite some time now. So maybe this is a ratcheting up of the pressure, the ratcheting up of the violence. But Russia's approach has been extraordinarily violent to the people of Ukraine, in captured Ukraine as well. And of course, many of these people in Ukraine who were Russian-speaking, identified as Russian, are deeply resentful for what Putin and the Russian military and Wagner have done in Ukraine, and are understandably motivated to join the Ukrainian forces and to push back and to cause chaos for the Russian military, who've got their dispersed elements behind the lines, looking to protect themselves against an offensive that's going to come from Ukraine. This is the thing. The Ukrainians now have the German and American tanks coming, the British tanks, they have the F-16s coming. This is unnerving for the Russians, with the special forces operations, the Russian volunteer forces, like operating behind lines. That's hugely problematic for Russia and for Wagner.
So, one final question to you. You know, Denmark has now offered to host Ukraine peace talks, but they want India, China and Brazil to be on board with these mediation peace talks. Do you see any hope there?
Oh, look, I think it's a great idea. It's a very clever way of engaging countries that have an important role to play. India, of course, as you know, has good credibility with Russia. It's retained its relations with Russia despite the pressure from the West to take a stronger stance against Russia over the war in Ukraine. It's in a position to contribute in a constructive way. The Netherlands is obviously very well placed they've got The Hague. You know, it's a very internationally prominent location in terms of dealing with international criminal and war crimes and military, you know, international martial affairs, if you like. We know the Hague Conventions come from this very country. So the idea of the Netherlands being instrumental is very welcome, and the other countries can play into that space as well, with complementary angles, complementary pressure, if you like, to bring some negotiations to a head.
All right, Professor Blaxland, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective on this story.
Good to be with you, Rohit.